Let's look at some of the problems with massive giant swords. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator. So I've got 3 examples that I'm going to be using for this video, but really you can apply these principles or the points I'm going to make in this video to any giant sword. It could be a European Zweihander, as they're commonly known today, perhaps Spadone, Montante, Beidenhander, whatever name you want to use, or indeed you could use it something like the Chinese Miao Dao, or you could apply this to something like the earlier Han Dynasty two-handed sword, the Jian in this case. And it's very easy to get excited about massive swords. I get excited about massive swords. I'm sure you do as well, because anyone who's used to handling normal swords, as soon as you stick something even bigger, beefier and meaty in their hands, they get pretty excited usually, I find. I certainly do. And you know, it's the added reach, the added power. It feels just so formidable, I guess. But this massive size does come with some issues. I won't say problems, but some issues that you need to be aware of. Now, there's some obvious things that we could think about here, such as the fact that a giant sword isn't very good in a confined space, and it's difficult to carry, and it's heavier, and things like that. But that's not really what I'm talking about. Rather, I'm talking about the structure of the sword, and how when we're using these giant swords, assuming we've decided that's what we're going to be using for whatever reasons, because it's the weapon to suit the job that we need to achieve, there are some things that you need to be aware about these swords which might come back to bite you if you don't bear them in mind. Now, the points I'm going to be looking at in this video essentially come down to the fact that when you make something longer, you make it proportionately heavier, but you also, in proportion to, in ratio to its total size, you essentially make it thinner. Now, indeed, we could make a sword, we could simply scale up a sword. So you could take something like an arming sword, or a long sword, a bastard sword, a Dao, a Jian, whatever, and you could just scale it up. But then it would be massively heavy. One of the problems when we make a massive sword, and bear in mind that this sword from Coveton here is up to my eyes, okay, and I'm 6'1", so that is a pretty large sword, and yet I can hold it out. It's not easy, but I can hold it out with my left hand, that's my non-dominant hand, from the pommel end, or fairly easily with my dominant arm from the top of the grip. Okay, so this is a sword that has to be wieldable. Yes, indeed, normally we're using 2 hands and the hands are spread far apart, and the way that I spread the weight across my legs and move around assists with this. However, in order for this to be a wieldable, usable sword in war, there are compromises to its ratios compared to a normal sized sword that we have to make. So if we take something like this Miao Dao, for example, this has a pipe back section, and the blade is very, very thin, but has a rod back, as found on certain British officers' swords of the 19th century, incidentally, and Prussian swords as well. I'll probably talk more about the Miao Dao in a dedicated video soon, but this is actually really quite a crazy light sword for its size. The Zweihander isn't, but of course they're different swords, different times, different purposes. This is actually a 20th century version of the Miao Dao. So for attacking unarmoured opponents, for the most part, who don't even have swords. And this, of course, is a sword from the 16th century, which was designed potentially to hit people in armour, to hit halberds and pikes, and all of this kind of stuff. So very different purposes, but nevertheless, they both have to observe the laws of physics. Okay, now, what am I wittering on about? Well, the simple fact is, if you make a weapon longer, it will become floppier and flexible in relation to its size. Okay, so whereas an arming sword might be really quite stiff, if you made that blade longer and longer and longer, it would get floppier and floppier and floppier. And frankly, floppy weapons come with certain drawbacks. Ideally, we'd all like a really stiff weapon, wouldn't we? The stiffer the better in most circumstances. However, you simply can't make something of this size that is of a wieldable weight and always make it stiff. You have to accept a degree of floppiness sometimes. With these giant swords, we can easily demonstrate this floppiness by holding it in one hand and giving it a good old bashing at the pommel end, and you'll see how wobbly that blade is. Indeed, if I swap over to the Han Dynasty Jian, two-handed Jian, and I do the same thing here, we've got the same thing. it does return to true quicker, partially because it's a lighter sword. And so there's less inertia, there's less energy carried in the oscillation, and it returns to stiff and straight quicker. However, there is, as you can see, quite a lot of wobble in this sword. So, big giant swords are often wobbly. Perhaps one of the least wobbly is this Miao Dao. It does still vibrate quite a bit, and you can see by the oscillation, let's hold it this way around, you can see by the oscillation in the pommel, when I hold it, it's still got quite a lot of wobble in it. Not to say you don't get that with shorter swords, you do, just not as much as the giant swords. So what is the problem with floppiness? Why is this wobble an issue? Well, I've broken down the issue of wobbliness in your weapon, or floppiness in your weapon, into 5 essential points as I see it, the 5 most important points. Maybe not the only ones, but the 5 most critical ones that you need to bear in mind when you're using this type of very big, large, and sometimes floppy weapon. But before I go on, I have great friends over at Olight, and I want to have a very quick word about the fantastic new Olight Warrior 3S torch, which I've been trying out. And also, if you notice down below, there's some promotions because Olight is celebrating their 15th birthday. Olight torches and lights are absolutely freaking awesome. I'm sure they don't need any further commendation from me, because if you're interested in tactical gear or torches or sticking things on your rifles, you'll know all about Olight already. So here is the Warrior 3S. I've actually been using this for a week or so now, and I've managed to spot some very interesting things at night with it. That sounds very dubious, but I've been having some trouble with some of my pets being harassed by a predator, and I used some night vision equipment and ultimately this to identify it as a fox. Now, let me tell you, at 2300 lumens, this is an absolute beast of a tool. Now, this can actually also be attached to a firearm, and it uses the same button press or trigger mechanism at the back. If you've got one separately, or if you've got one from the Odin, you can apply it to this. It clips on. This does come with a belt clip. This does in fact come with a belt pouch as well. And this is primarily an everyday carry torch, but with 2300 lumens. One of the important things as well, one of the important changes, if I just push this here, you have a battery indicator, and by pressing a number of times, you can see how powerful that is. You also have a power output indicator. So you can make the torch shine at different levels, and it will also give you an indicator showing you how charged it is. Anyway, happy birthday to Olight, 15 years, how amazing. They have really dominated their corner of the market, I think. They've got more and more great products, so check out the links down below. Hopefully the discounts there will mean that you can get yourself a nice present for the birthday celebration. And thanks again to Olight for sending me this. So let's get back to my 5 points of why there is a problem with having a floppy weapon. Well, the first one is kind of obvious if you actually think about it, and that is penetration. Okay, if you've got a floppy weapon, it is difficult, by no means impossible, and it depends very much on the target that you're trying to penetrate. But if you're trying to get good penetration, stiffness is always beneficial. And quite simply, if a weapon is floppy, at the moment of impact, you will lose energy to flex in the blade. So if I just use the wooden post behind me and apply a little bit of force, you can see the blade flexes pretty damned quickly and easily. Now, that's not to say that all Zweihanders or all, Han Dynasty Jian are necessarily have a problem with this. Some are stiffer than others, and it really comes down to the thickness of the spine. Okay, so what fullers do, the groove in a blade, what fullers do is they reduce mass while keeping the maximum spine thickness. So they keep stiffness and rigidity, which is useful, as we're looking at here, while reducing mass. One of the problems with making the spine thicker is you've got to find other ways of reducing mass when you add mass to the thicker spine. So there are differences between swords, but generally speaking, if you're making a blade longer and longer and longer, then in proportion to its length, it's becoming thinner and thinner and thinner, which means when you try and stab things, it will be an issue. Now, it's interesting to note that a lot of the large two-handed swords from around the world are cut-centric rather than thrust-centric, which is almost kind of the opposite of what you think, wouldn't you? Because obviously pole arms and spears and things like that, you think if you're thrusting, you want reach. But actually with these, the problem is you've got a steel blade that still has to be of manageable weight, so you make it longer, but that makes it floppier. So, thrusting can be an issue. Not to say you can't thrust with these swords, but, and I'll just do, this is a sharp, so I can't grab the end of it, but if I put it into the post again, they do, with thrusts, flex really, really quite easily. So that means that their thrusting power or energy that they're delivering to the target is less. On one hand, you could say at the moment of impact, they're delivering more momentum because they have greater mass. But as soon as they start to flex, all of that energy is taken up in the blade and deflected off to the side and isn't going into your opponent. So if you want to thrust deeply in an opponent, a shorter blade and therefore a proportionately more rigid blade is often better. Now the second point to be aware of is in cutting. Now you would think so long as you cut with perfect edge alignment and you've got a long blade, so therefore a long lever with high tip velocity, it's going to cut well. And yes, indeed, that's true. However, we're humans, we're not robots, and very few of us have perfect cutting form. And one of the problems with a floppy blade, and this can also be found with certain types of one-handed and you know, shorter bladed swords as well, but it becomes exacerbated with large, long-bladed two-handed swords, is that the floppiness, if there is any slightly off angle with your cut, when you hit the target, because the blade is more flexible, it has a tendency of wrapping around the target and exacerbating the wrongness of your angle, if I can put it like that. Now, funnily enough, if you ever watched the show Forged in Fire, you will see that a lot of times when they're testing larger bladed, longer bladed swords, this is more often a problem. So whoever's cutting, whether it's Doug or David Baker, whoever's cutting, then this can be a problem, okay? So your edge alignment has to be almost more perfect, more infallible with a larger, longer, floppier blade than with a shorter, stiffer one. Shorter, stiffer blades, like a katana, for example, are very forgiving. Longer, floppy blades are very unforgiving, okay? That's the first issue with cutting. There's a secondary issue with cutting. Now that is, if I just move my cable out of the way, that is oftentimes when you're cutting, unlike when you're cutting a tatami mat where you start from point A, you cut through and you finish in point B, when you're actually fighting someone, often you'll start to do something and you'll see they'll cover that line, and so you'll quickly switch around to somewhere else. Now these changes in direction can also exacerbate the floppy problem, as I will call it. So quite simply, if we take a simple example, if I intend to cut from the right and I see that they're protecting that line, they start to parry, essentially, start to guard that side, I might switch round to the left. Now in that, there is a lateral movement that requires me to get round, however I do it, whether I lift the hands or keep the hands low, there is a lateral movement that requires me to move the blade sideways before I realign it for the next cut again. I don't know if you heard that on camera, but I got decent edge alignment with that second cut because it whistled. So during that, as I'm changing alignment, I'm now having to get alignment correct again before I come through with my second cut. And that could apply to a cut downwards from the right and then upwards from the right, or downwards from the right and upwards from the left, or whatever. During these lateral movements, I get the blade essentially flops one way or the other. And this means, or can mean, that at the moment of impact, I will not have a straight blade. It can mean that at the moment when I hit the target, my blade actually looks like that. And that can be a real problem for cutting through things. So to wrap up that point, not only is floppiness, does it require more preciseness of your cutting form in the initial cut, but also in real fencing terms, when you're actually moving the sword around and changing angles, it can exacerbate problems in that as well. So even for cutting, not just for thrusting, even for cutting, floppiness in a blade can be problematic. It can make certain things less successful, and also if there's anything incorrect in your form, particularly with cutting angles, it will exacerbate, sometimes fatally, that problem. What do I mean by that? Well, again, if we come back to the Forged in Fire analogy, sometimes if I hit the target and the blade is in the process of either being slightly twisted or flexed because I've changed direction, what happens is the blade wraps around the target, and if there's anything wrong with the steel of your blade or the heat treatment, it can break or bend the blade on the target. That's a worst case scenario. A best case scenario, it just doesn't cut. It will just give the person a bruise, or it won't pass through clothes or this kind of stuff. So, floppiness of a blade can be a huge issue for cutting. However, one caveat I would add to that is that the relative length and thinness of the blade, so a floppy blade that's used perfectly, can pass through a target like it's not even there because there's so little resistance, because you've got so much velocity in the blade and the blade has got such a narrow cross section that it can go straight through. But if you get your angles wrong, it will punish you. So we've looked at the first 2 points, which are issues with thrusting, issues with cutting. Now the third point is issues with parrying or binding or blocking or guarding, whatever particular defensive movement you want to use, or whatever terminology you want to use to apply to it. What do I mean by that? Quite simply, if someone cuts at my head and I stick my sword in the way in order to not get hit in the head, or indeed if I swing my own sword at theirs, either of those, if I stick it in the way, quite simply, a more flexible blade, and I'll switch to the blunt weapon here, a more flexible blade makes for a less nice parry in general, okay? And the reason being that, because we've already got a floppy blade, you can see the oscillation in this, because we've already got a floppy blade, any impact into the flat of the blade or that's not directly into the edge will lead to this type of oscillation. Whether it's a quick oscillation or a slow oscillation depends on the nature of the sword. However, it does mean that your defences will not feel as solid as they would do with a proportionately stiffer blade, a shorter, thicker blade or whatever. Now there are ways you can mitigate this. One of those is to make your defences, if you have a floppy sword, never ever try to defend with the upper half of the blade. Some people will say, oh, but Matt, you should never try and defend with the upper half of the blade anyway. Sorry, but you're wrong, okay? Whether you look at foil and epee, or whether you look at rapier, whether you look at sabre, whether you look at longsword, there are defences with the end of the blade, historically and in modern fencing, okay? So yes, indeed, you can defend with the upper part of the blade. However, there are lots of advantages to parrying with the bottom half of the blade due to rigidity. This is called the fort, which means French for strong, for that reason, okay? It's closer to your hand, you've got preferential leverage, and it is a stiffer and thicker portion of the blade. Also, if you want to be really finicky about it, it damages the edge less as well, because you're not cutting people down here, you're cutting them up there. So, there's all sorts of advantages to defending with the bottom of the blade. Additionally, tactical benefits as well. If you actually do defend with the base of the blade, it leaves your tip free to keep that bind there and put the point in and things like this. So there are plenty of advantages. However, purely to say this, and without belabouring the point too much, with a floppy blade, you will find that you almost entirely want to defend with the bottom half of the blade. Whereas with a stiffer blade, something like a stiff-bladed Type 17 longsword, or a Type 14 arming sword, or a gladius, or whatever, with a stiffer blade, you'll find there are lots of defensive blade actions you can do with the tip, okay, or with the second half of the blade. With a long floppy blade, for the most part, you won't want to do that. Most of your defensive actions will want to be with the base of the blade. The only exception are where you're striking into a strike, essentially deflecting. So for example, if someone gives a big Oberhau from the right side, aimed at my head here, and I'm a bit limited to movement here because of the length of the sword and the fact that I'm attached to a cable, if you see that cut coming in here, and you fly off to the right hand side with your own Zornhau, trying to hit the light fitting, smack into their blade, so you're essentially cutting into the flat of their blade, that's a sort of deflection, okay? It's a beat or a deflection. And that's kind of different, because in that case you are swinging the edge of your blade into the flat of their blade. So you kind of reverse the disadvantages you have for having a floppy blade. Assuming they've got a similar blade, you reverse the tables in that case, and you exploit the floppiness of their blade by hitting the flat with the stiff edge of your blade. So there are ways around it. But just generally to say that in binding, where your two blades are stuck against each other with a floppy blade, you're going to want to favour the base of the blade. So point number 4 is half swording. Right, so why am I listing half swording? Well, half swording is a funny one, because on one hand, it's a way of mitigating or lessening the effect of the floppiness. I'll talk about that in a second. But also, half-swording's less pleasant with a floppier blade. So what do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, if our blade is floppy like this in thrusting, okay, say I was trying to stab someone who was wearing mail armor or lamella or something like that. So something where there is some remote possibility that I might be able to thrust through the armor. So it's a very resisting target. Could even be against a gambeson or a jack or something like this. If I'm doing it purely by holding the hilt, then what's often going to happen when I meet that resisting target is the entire blade will bend. When I half sword, instead I have to get a bit closer, but I support my blade here, and what I've now done is I've meant that really the part of the blade that's offending the opponent is only the bit above my lead hand, which means that I've gone from a blade that's this long and therefore very floppy to a blade that's only this long and therefore proportionately less floppy. In other words, I've essentially made the operating part of my blade thicker, okay, in proportion to the length and therefore less likely to flex. So in one sense, half swording is a way of mitigating the flop, so to speak. So if you've got a problem with the flop, try grabbing halfway up the shaft or halfway up the blade. Okay, now conversely what I would say is that if you are half swording, if you're in a situation where you're half swording, for example fighting in armour, generally speaking, a stiffer bar will be both safer and more pleasant to try and half sword with. Okay, when you're trying to half sword with any sword, then having this as a rigid object makes all of those techniques, for example, if you're putting this across someone's throat and you put your foot behind their leg and you're trying to throw them, or if you're trying to stab into an armpit through male voiders between the plates, then a stiff blade will be more advantageous in doing that in every way. Additionally, in holding a sharp blade, assuming it's not a blunt blade, in holding a sharp blade, if the blade is constantly flexing inside your hand, it is more difficult, in my experience, to keep a good, safe grip on the weapon. When the blade is stiffer, and therefore also thicker in most cases, what you find is it is easier to keep a good secure grip on the blade without your hand sliding or without risk of cutting through the leather gloves of your gauntlets. So basically, half sword, yes, is a way of mitigating the flop in the blade, but additionally, if you have to half sword, you'd rather have a stiff blade than the floppy one. So something to bear in mind for big two-handed swords. They're not really optimized for half swording, and certainly in the treatises of the time, we don't really see them used that way. Okay, so to finish off, the final disadvantage of very big swords stemming from their floppiness is one that I think a lot of people won't necessarily know unless you've ever owned one of these really big swords or tried to make one. And this is durability of the hilt. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of people, when they look at the flexibility of swords, focus on the blade. But what they don't notice, necessarily, is that the hilt is flexing as well. Okay, now bear in mind that the blade, at least in most swords, the blade continues through the hilt to some point, usually near the end, and has a tang. Okay, the tang is the extension of the blade. Therefore, any oscillation in the blade is going to continue through the tang. Now the blade and the tang are made of steel, usually one piece of steel these days, traditionally often an iron tang forge welded onto a steel body of the blade. However, those two things are one piece of metal and they have a certain oscillation to them. Now, what you've done is you've attached a guard, a grip, and very often a pommel or pommel cap of some kind to this. And they don't flex in the same way as the tang. Now, with shorter swords, you could say this is also a factor, but with shorter swords, they have considerably shorter grips. So what's really a problem with these types of swords is that it's very common in use for them to get loose grips or for the grips to crack. And the basic reason is because the wood either side of the tang does not flex at the same angles and at the same rate as the tang wants to flex inside. And I have actually seen large two-handed swords where the tang has bent slightly and completely destroyed the wooden grip because, of course, there's a huge amount of leverage on such a long tang. This is not really a problem with most long swords, and it's almost never a problem with arming swords. But when you have a tang that's this long, that's a huge amount of stresses, essentially, stresses and strains on the thing that surrounds that tang. So, there's an additional point as well. Because the grip is undergoing flexing when you're using the sword, that also leads to compression of the wood or whatever material, usually organic material the grip's made of, and that leads to loosening up of the guard and sometimes loosening up of the pommel, okay? Because you essentially squash the wood gets compressed as it flexes each way, it gets compressed between the fittings at top and bottom of the hilt. So anyway, without going to huge levels of detail, two-handed swords, when you've got a really long blade, and particularly when it's a more floppy blade, not only because you've got a very, very long grip, which introduces all sorts of stresses and strains in the hilt, which you wouldn't have with a shorter one, but in addition to that, the floppiness and the oscillations continue through the grip, and that adds even more stress and kind of wear and tear to the hilt of the sword. So that is the fifth and final problem, should we say, or issue to be aware of with two-handed swords. Thanks a lot for watching. Please make sure you're subscribed if you're not already. I'd really appreciate that. Also give us a like if you found this video at all useful or interesting. Also check out those links below if you're at all interested in getting a top quality torch either for your pocket or your rifle. Then Olight are, I would say, the company to go to, and now is the time to buy from them because they've got those massive 15th anniversary reductions and special offers on. So go and check out those links below. I will see you really soon back on Scholar Gladiatoria channel. Thanks for watching. Take care. See you soon.